Hello and welcome back for another video on your Earth Science Lab. So again, these videos have been created for you as kind of as a tool to be able to watch, to work through these labs, provide tips, tricks, and just different ways to make this a little more efficient and effective. So this time we'll be working on Lab 7, which is really a multifaceted lab. It covers quite a bit of topics. It covers fluvial, Aeolian, and glacial landscapes, which in other terms, as we'll be discussing very quickly and yet briefly, rivers, dry regions, deserts in particular, as well as other glacial landscapes. So that being said, let's start with Earth Science Lab 7. So as we can see, the objectives for this lab are to compare and contrast 3 different drainage basins. We'll also identify the processes that create cut banks, point bars, and other fluvial features. We'll also be able to explain how arid regions are classified. We'll also compare and contrast 3 different types of sand dunes, at least, and be able to identify erosional, depositional, and other types of glacial landscape features. So to begin, within our introduction, as we can see here, I provide a background of each one of these environments. What type of processes are involved, what do we acknowledge it with, and really just what are those terms that we'll be utilizing for this lab. So I'm going to actually just kind of move a little bit forward on here because you guys can certainly take the time to read that. Now moving into part A, which is specifically fluvial landscapes. So we first begin discussing just the material that's being moved by running water. Stream capacity refers to the total sediment that a stream can carry. Stream competence is the ability of a stream to transport a particular size particle. Both of these variables change with the stream's velocity or its speed. Streams and rivers transport materials in a number of different ways. These include dissolved, suspended, as well as bed load. So as we can see here, I provided for you definitions of each types of these loads. So dissolved load is composed of ions in a solution, and these ions are usually carried in water all the way to the ocean. So what I'm drinking here is a glass of iced tea. So you can see a little bit of tea in there. So I can see on the side here of the cup that there is some material that has been completely dissolved within inside this glass of iced tea. I cannot pull the tea leaves out. It's been completely dissolved within that solution. Now we also have a term called suspended load. Suspended load is composed of sediments that are carried as a solid in the water, and it can be a variation of different sizes, but just for our purposes here, the ice cubes that are sitting up on the top, those are suspended. They're floating within that solution, within that water. And then bed load. Bed load sediments are just way too big. Those are the clasts that sink to the bottom of the glass. They're too heavy to float. They're not able to be dissolved within, so they just drop and sink to the bottom of the cup. So you can think of it like this. You can think of it like when you're adding those crystal light or mineral packets to your water bottles, and when some of it gets dissolved, some floats on the top, and then you get some of those big chunks or clasts that sink on the bottom. Now, as it says also when discussing bed load, some of these material, this motion can be either derived as being saltation or traction. Saltation means that as the water's moving, you have some clasts that are too big to float, but they're able to become mobile, and they bounce, bounce. And when they bounce, they crash into other material and sets them to move. And so you see this little bouncing. We see actually saltation also in desert areas, but in particular we see this happening in bed load. And then we have also traction. Traction is just when it just gets dragged along the bottom. So for this activity question 1, it says, please, I'm not asking you to be an artist, or at least the best you can. It says to draw. So as you can see here, draw your bed. Maybe I'm going to use blue up here for a little bit of water. Okay. So within my drawing, how do I draw dissolved load? How can I draw suspended load? And how can I represent bed load as both saltation and traction, right? So maybe my bed load is going to be these really big rocks on the bottom, and I'm going to say that they're really big clasts that are getting dragged along the bottom. However you want to do it, you need to then draw all of these within that space. So then we can move on into meandering streams. So I'm going to kind of scroll up to this point here. So it says here, one such feature that results from both erosion and deposition is a meandering stream. Rivers initially, as you'll learn in your lectures here, are very aggressive in the sense that they like to incise. Normally when we talk about stuff like this, there is a form of slope, and rivers are usually in a, if this was a, if I were to pour my iced tea on this piece of paper, if it's very steep, like a mountain peak, that water would shoot straight down that paper in a very quick path. But as more material is eroded and transported and deposited elsewhere, that slope will begin to decrease. Then I pour, my iced tea, it will still go down, but now it starts to wiggle a little more. And then when I have it almost flat, the water still goes down, but it's going to go really, these big windy pieces. Well, those big windy pieces are called meanders. And that happens, in that aging process of erosion, transportation, and deposition. So it says here, once a river descends down to a lower valley floor, the flow rates of the water tend to vary within that active channel. On straight stretches of river, the flow rate is generally slower along the bed due to traction and friction. But however, when there's a slight bend, that material and the water begins to divert its area of intensity. So think of it like your car. You're driving in your car, and then all of a sudden you make a and all the energy is focused in the middle above, not on the ground, because the ground there's friction, because of the tires and the road when you're driving. And then you make a sharp turn. Well, if I make a sharp turn going this way, what happens to all the milk and all the groceries in the back seat? I'm going this way. They're going to go that way, right? Because they were already in motion. And so what ends up happening in that sense is, look at this diagram down below. If the car is if the car is driving right in the middle, all of a sudden it's like, I gotta make a turn. It's going to be thrown to the outside on that curve, and then it works its way back towards the middle. Well, in that process, you will have an area of active erosion. This red line represents what we call the talweg. The talweg, T-H-A-L-W-E-G, is generally the fastest part of a stream. We see that we'll have an area of erosion. We'll also have an area where there's not a lot of velocity. See how the arrows are kind of distributed? This is usually an area of sand or gravel. It's like a point bar. So what's interesting is, if we were to envision this a little bit more farther, if I were to continue our drawing, maybe to something kind of like this, and I go back to red. Again, it goes straight, and it gets thrown on the outside, and then it works its way back towards the middle. Well, what's important about that, which is really kind of an interesting feel, use green, is there's active erosion. This is a cut bank. Material will be eroded from there, and it will be then taken and deposited down here in the area where there's slower velocities. That makes sense, right? If there's a slower velocity, material is going to be deposited. If it's faster, it's going to be moved. So we kind of have this bouncing effect. And what's interesting is that these curves continue to broaden out, and you get these much larger, broader meanders. So I can go ahead and erase that. So question 2 says, well, refer to this diagram here in particular. On which side of the river would you anticipate to be the most erosion? This is looking at figure B. Where is the area of most erosion? Well, remember, erosion is going to be happening where the flow is fastest. This is point B. This is looking from above down. This is a profile view. So this is, I'm standing in the water and I'm seeing that, oh, it's much deeper over here. And that's because this fastest flow is causing erosion to occur. So you'll go ahead and answer these questions looking at either the right-hand side of these profiles, or looking at the overhead profile. Part B says, on which side of the river shown in example B would you anticipate more deposition or material to be deposited? And lastly, part C, applying what you've learned, put your thinking cap on. If this were to occur over a great deal of time, what change would you anticipate for the path of this river? Then explain your response. So if if things were to continue as they were, what do you think would happen? Would the river straighten out, or would over time you would continue to dig and make bigger meanders, which would then create new features called meander scars, all of which you'll learn within your readings for this lab. So then that brings us to the next step of rivers, which is called stream order, which I'll do right about there. So stream order is actually quite interesting, very much like you would at looking at a piece of a leaf. So if this is a line, this is where the water exits. This is where the leaf was connected to the tree. And then, within that leaf, you'll see that there are little branches that go out, right? Well, these little branches represent what we call a tributary or a reach that is contributing to the main stem. So we don't count the exit, right? Well, this is the same thing with rivers. Maybe this is a canyon, and now we have these other areas. So there's different ways that we do it. We're going to use what's called the Shreve method. So it says tributaries can be, should we draw one more on here? And maybe one there. Perfect. I'll use red. Tributaries can be separated into sections called reaches. For each reach will be assigned a number, starting with the number 1. When 2 first-order streams meet, then the next one will be a second order, and so on and so forth. So to make this simple for ourselves, we could do this. This is a number 1, because there's 1 point. This is a number 1. There's 1 point. This is a number 1. But see how they all meet here? 1 and 1 make 2, plus 1 more. This is worth 3 reaches. There's 1 more here. 4. There's 1 and 1 and 1. 4 and 1 is 5. Plus 1 and 1. So this is a total value of 7. So that's how we would do this stream order. You're just counting the tips. You're just counting the reaches that are reaching out to try to gather more water for your primary stream. So what we have here is an old map that shows the major river here within Klamath Mountains. There's the squares represent property lines, and there's roads, but we're mostly looking at the different reaches or the rivers themselves. So we're going to be looking at the Meta Creek, the Roach Creek, and the Tule Creek. These are all little canyons that are meeting the main river. So the best way to do this is to really just to outline it. So I'm going to use red so it's easy to see. So Meta Creek, I'm looking for Meta, there's Meta. Meta Creek meets right here. It's touching the main river. So that means I'm going to count everything that's attached to that. So I'm going to just outline Meta Creek just so I can see everything that I need to count within there. Perfect. So this is my little drainage basin. It looks like a big leaf, right? So my job is to count every tip. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 1 there. 11. Meta has an order of 11. How did I do that? I counted each individual, speck or reach that are on here. Very simple. In olden days, the way that we'd do it is, go 1 and 1 is 2 and 1 is 3, 1 is 4, but it's such a small number. Now, generally, if you're counting all these, you're going to get really large numbers, so you'd want to break it up into smaller pieces. Like you could say, well, everything within here has a value of 9. That might be easier to do, but nonetheless, you're going to do the same thing for Roach, and you're going to do the same thing for Tule. I'm going to do pink for Roach. So same thing, Roach Creek meets the main Klamath River right here, which means everything that's part of Roach Creek, if you kind of, I missed that one little piece there, I'll have to fix that. Roach Creek is much bigger. Look how big this canyon is with all these reaches. So you're going to count every little reach that's on the outside of here, and then you'll do the same thing for Tule. So you'll have numbers for both of these. So, and then why is this important? That's an excellent question. Thanks for asking. So imagine again that we have this, river. Think of like a road. This is where it all goes to. The water's all draining down to this 1 point, draining out. Traffic, right? You have 1 house, 1 car on this road. Perfect. So maybe you live right here. So now you're only dealing with 1 car on the same road that you live on. 1. Well, then you add another street, and you add another house. So this guy only has 1 until it meets here. Now it has 2. So now you're going to see 2 cars driving on your street. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So on and so forth. The higher the number, the more people are passing through. The higher the number over here, the more potential you have of flooding, the more water you have that's going to be distributed and passed down that system. So we keep this, in part of our stream team data. I'm like, wait a minute. We have people who are living at the end of Roach Creek, and Roach Creek has a much higher Shreve order than Meta and Tule, even probably combined. So therefore, if there's a big flood or a big rain, people who live down here, we should probably have them evacuate, because we don't know how much water could really move in, because it has the potential, because it has more reaches and more little creeks and tributaries that will contribute the greater amount of water. So that's kind of the purpose for that. So then we move to our last part here, fluvial, and looking at drainage basins. So drainage basins are just like our leaves that we were just looking at. Over time, a stream system achieves a particular pattern based on the tributaries itself, as well as some of the geologic factors such as the rock type, the slope, things like that. Drainage patterns are nets, and they're classified based on their form and texture. Their shape or patterns develop in response to the local topography and the underlying interstitial geology. So what I've done here is I've provided for you a name of a type as well as a great definition that will be very helpful for you later on. Your job is to match them. So as an example, we'll do the first one. Dendritic. A dendritic drainage pattern is the most common. It looks just like a leaf, right? And looks like the branching patterns of a leaf or a tree or a root system. It develops in regions of underlying geology, is similar to resistance to weathering, so there's no apparent control over that. Well, the only one that looks like very natural would be this one. This is letter A. Remember, this is where the water is where it exits. So whenever you're looking at a drainage basin, it all merges into one piece. That one piece is that exit. So that's kind of how you know where water's coming from and where it's going. So this would be best for A. Parallel. Parallel drainage patterns form where there's a pronounced slope. So it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be like parallel, but there's a very distinct slope. A parallel pattern also develops in regions of parallel or elongated landforms, like outcrops of resistant banding. So most people look at this and go, oh, those are parallel, but look, they're intersecting. They're not parallel, they're more of a trellis. This one down here, these are very elongated, so this would be better matched as part B. So you'll do the same thing for the remaining drainage basins. You'll match the definition to the most appropriate. People often have harder times with drainage patterns like this, but remember, in this case, see, all the branches are meeting here. So the water is going that way. The water is going away from that. But in this sense, all of these are meeting in the middle, which means the water must be puddling in the middle. So you get to learn, oh, is this a volcano and water is going away, or is it a bowl and all the water is going into the middle of it? So that is your crash course into fluvial geomorphology. And so that wraps up part A. So welcome to part B, Aeolian landscapes. Again, in most cases, we would be able to spend like entire weeks on this, but because this is an earth science course, we have to learn a lot about a lot of different things. So we do kind of push through this rather quickly. Again, if you can always pause it, go back, but do watch the lectures first. That really does help work through these. So make sure you do have a clear understanding as to what's happening in these environments. Anyway, Aeolian landscapes, with nearly 1/3 of the land surface being considered a desert or arid land, meaning that it receives minimal rainfall. These regions support yet impressive vegetation and a limited yet unique population to animals and humans. So, desert regions, I know that living in California, Death Valley, the Great Mojave, very intimidating, because of the name. But if you have not had an opportunity to check out how beautiful these landscapes are during nice weather, not during the summer, they are unbelievable. The key with these arid regions is about the amount of precipitation. Does the amount of precipitation does it exceed or is it less than the rate of evaporation? So what does that mean? So maybe this is my iced tea cup. Water is going to evaporate naturally in environments. So I also have rain that can come in and fill the cup. But over the course of the year, will this cup be more empty or more full, right? Because if I have constant rain, the cup will always be full. It will never evaporate fast enough. But in places such as arid regions, the rate of evaporation, the amount of water that can leave, will exceed that more than it will ever get in a year. Like Death Valley itself can get, it's not uncommon for it to get, maybe 12 to 20 inches of evaporation, meaning that if you had a lake that was 20 inches deep, it could evaporate an entire year. Yet they only get about 2 inches of rain per year, so it's very, very, very dry. Now we have 3 categories that we're going to use for our purposes. We have extremely arid, arid, and semi-arid. Extremely arid is at least 12 months with no rainfall. Arid is about 250 millimeters, or about less than 10 inches of rain per year. And then semi-arid is between about 10 and 20 inches of rain, or 250 to 500 millimeters of precipitation. So we can actually use a very distinct measurement to distinguish between those 3. A great example of an area that can be extremely arid, the Atacama Desert. It's not uncommon for them to have just snowfall, if anything, and it'll be, the rate of precipitation could be as much as the thickness of a grain of hair. So very, very limited limited precipitation, almost unmeasurable. Great QR code, so you can just, with your cell phone, take a photo of that, or you can click that hyperlink and it takes you to a Google Earth window where it will take you to our lowest elevation in North America, negative 282 feet below the sea level at Badwater Basin, which is really incredible. So, aside from just aridity, measurement, the easiest thing that we can work on and that we can identify are going to be sand dunes, right? The sand dunes are what we find in these arid regions, because all the water is evaporated, we have erosion, transportation, deposition, grains of material break down, and we get left with these big barren areas with, coarser grained material that's being moved around by wind. So we can talk about some of those properties when looking at this. So it says the shape and design of a dune will vary with the amount of sand that is available, or the volume, as well as the complication or the type of wind velocity or variability. So that being said, we're going to work a little bit with this. It says, we can say here that the three types of wind variability will be unimodal. So unimodal is this fan right behind me. It's blowing in one direction only. Bimodal is when you have two different directions. So what if I had a fan over here on this thing? So I had two winds converging. And then complex, which means that you got wind all over the place. It's, my hair would be on end and you got wind twirling around and it's such a mess. So that's the first thing. So are we dealing with singular flows, bimodal, or multiple very complex amounts of wind? Then we can on top of that rank it in the amount of diversity or volume of sand. Do we have limited, a lot a bit, or ton? They're really limitless. And depending on the amount of sand and the amount of energy that you have to move it can depict on the type of dunes that we have. So that being said, here I have the 6 most common dunes. Are there others? Absolutely. We've got Nebka dunes, dome dunes, blowouts, so many different ones that are not mentioned. These are the most common 6 that we see: Barchan, parabolic, star, transverse, linear, and Barchanoid ridge. So what you have is a very distinct definition. So with that definition, you need to decide, what type of environment. Is it unimodal or complex? Does it have a limited or a limitless sand supply? So after you read the definition, you decide those factors. Once you do that for all 6 of these dunes and you've now mastered the language behind it, okay, I understand that a Barchan dune, when it receives more and more and it gets to almost a limitless, it turns into a Barchanoid ridge, and then when it becomes limitless, it can turn into a transverse dune. You start to learn just the names and just the different varieties in which they work. Because of bimodal flows, everything gets elongated and stretched out and becomes into a line, or whatever it might be. Once you've mastered the name with the definition, the wind variability, as well as the sand complexity, you then move here. Here are 6 dunes. Your job now is to first identify the dune. Then you're going to need to identify the windward side, the slip face, and then draw arrows indicating the direction or directions of wind. So as you've worked through the videos and you work through this lab, you will learn these new terms, windward and slip face. So let me just draw it out super quick for you. I know we got a lot to do here. So here's my ground, and then I'm going to draw a line that looks something kind of like this. Okay, so the wind is blowing. The wind is blowing this direction here. The wind is blowing and moving little sand grains up, boop, 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 up the grain. The wind is hitting this side. This is the windward side, otherwise known as the Stoss side. The grains move, boop, 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 up, and then at some point they fall down. And they're sheltered because the wind continues to blow and generally goes whoosh, like this, like a skateboard. Whoosh. So this is sheltered. This sheltered side is known as the slip face because the little grains will slip and fall down this face, otherwise known as, so this is the slip face, otherwise known as the leeward side. All dunes will have a windward and a leeward side. It just kind of depends on what's happening in that case. So these are your classic Barchan dunes right up here. You can see that the wind is blowing, and as you'll learn in the definitions as you work through it, the wind is going in this direction. It kind of spreads, it does get split apart a little bit there, but it's in one direction. All the sand is being moved here, and then it slips down and builds these neat little crescents. These are called horns. The horns are actually pointing in the same direction the wind is flowing. So you get to really apply these terms. So you're going to identify the dune. Where's a windward side? Okay, windward is here. Where's the leeward side? Leeward's going to be on the inside here. And then it says to draw arrows indicating the direction. These are all one direction flows. Easy peasy. You're going to do that for all 6 of these dunes. Again, if you need additional support on these, watch the lecture that's been shared within this lab. I go through each of these sand dunes, identify them, draw it all out. So just make sure you take advantage of that. So anyway, that being said, that was your brief introduction to Aeolian environments. So we specifically looked at the precipitation types, the names that we can give those regions, as well as how to identify the 6 most common dunes. That being said, let's start with part C. All right, welcome to the last part of this lab. I'm sorry, I know this is a longer lab, but it's a lot of great information. It's going to help us wrap up this portion of our module. So now we're going to look at glaciers. Now we're only going to be looking at certain areas. As you'll learn, there's so many different areas in which we can look at. There's areas that are alpine, valley glaciers. We can look at erosional, depositional, even bodies of water that are formed just by glaciers. And I think what's impressive is that in this lab we talk about rivers, deserts, glaciers, all of which you can visit in California in the same day. We have evidence of deserts, we have evidence of glaciers, we've got evidence of, everything. And California is so diverse. But anyway, let's move into this. Glaciers are very effective agents of erosion, specifically when the ice is not quite frozen to the surface and is able to move and slide, grasp onto other rocks, pluck and abrade and push them and move them like bulldozers down slope. What is interesting is that the ice itself is not very effective on its own, but it's because it's very relatively soft. But since ice can pluck and abrade and those rock fragments are being embedded and scraped and dragged and broken up, that's what is able to make these incredible landscapes. Half Dome was a whole dome. Glacier, like a hot knife on butter, just slice that right in half and then allows it to then continue to exfoliate to create that very, very steep face. So we get to really observe this. Here's another QR code. Take your phone. You can take a photo of the QR code, or you can go ahead and click the link. It takes you to a Google link of the Devil's Postpile, which is by Mammoth. And that is, the place of fire and ice, where we can see basaltic material being scraped and eroded and polished and leaving, by glaciers. And then what we see is the remnants of that glaciation. So very similar to how we looked at these other environments, this time we're going to look specifically at erosional features. I have provided a list of erosional features here, such as glacial striations, U-shaped valleys or troughs, cirques, hanging valleys, arêtes, cols, horns, and truncated spurs. So your job is to read through these, master that definition, and then go to this diagram here and try to find it. Now there's lots of right answers, so I know that. So find just one, but make sure it's the right one. So as an example, we will do arêtes, because I'm going to use some terms. Once you read this, then this will make sense, right? So arête means it's a narrow blade-like ridge. So it's a very sinuous ridge of rock. When I lectured this content, I talk about ice cream. You have your big block of ice cream in your scooper, and you scoop all that ice cream away and you drag it and you put it in your bowl and you scoop and you pull. So when you're scooping all that ice cream, you're leaving that little ridge right in the middle. That ridge represents an arête. So as the glacier was developing up in the mountain peaks and carving a beautiful cirque and moving that material downhill, carving and plucking and abrading, you're going to be leaving these very sharp, sinuous ridges on either side of these cirques that we call arêtes. So it says here, blade-like ridges, often with cirques in between, are called arêtes. In addition to the development of a cirque and glacial erosions, freeze-thaw weathering further steepens these slopes along the sides, resulting in sharp ridges. When 3 or more of these arêtes will meet, a horn can be made, like the Matterhorn at Disneyland, right? So let's look at this very quick. I'm looking at my little diagram. Do I see anything that would represent an arête? And I'm looking, I'm like, oh wait, okay, hold on. It says that if it meets, it's going to be a peak. I can see there's a mountain peak here, right? There's a peak there. And look at this blade-like ridge. There's a blade-like ridge there. There's a blade-like ridge there. There's one there. There's one there. There's lots of them. These are all arêtes. They're all blade-like ridges because they were the rock was carved out here in this cirque. That material was transported down, way below in a drainage area into the trough and washed away, leaving behind these very sinuous sharp ridges. And sometimes, if my hands represent a coal, nice blade-like ridge, sometimes you can have a low point like that. That's called a coal. So you have your arête, and your coal is that low point within the arête. So perhaps that's something you have seen before. Another thing that really helps with this part of the lab too is Googling it. What does a cirque look like? What does an arête look like? What does a coal look like? Because this is a diagram, it's a table, I get it. And it's a black and white diagram, but if you just type on your phone, and you go, okay, I'm gonna open up Google, and I go here, and I go, what? And what is a cirque? C-I-R-Q-U-E. Or actually do arête, that's a good one. A-R-E-T, arête. I hit image. And one of the first images that pops up, we'll make it bigger that way, nope. There it is, blade-like ridge. I'm going to hold my phone very carefully so you can see it, and I can go, see, look at this, oops, you can see the blade-like ridge that's right on it as I'm pointing with my mouse. So you can see that, you can just Google it, and it'll help you find it. I know a little bit about a lot of it. I know it's very difficult, these labs, but it's because we have to cover so much in such a short amount of time and within this time allotment that we've got. So we've looked at arid, we looked at fluvial, we've looked at glacial. These are just little attributes. Are there more? Yes. You could take classes on glacial geomorphology and talk about so many different attributes. You could take classes on just deserts, on just rivers, entire 16-week courses in grad school on that. So I totally get that there's a lot more in hand. But we have to limit what we have and just do the big things. I try to pick the things that are most identifiable, the things that you will see on a field trip, things that you would see in your landscape and where you live. In fact, I didn't even notice, but the photo in the background here, this is Lake Sabrina, just west of Bishop. You can't see here, but up on the top are all arêtes. This is a tarn, which is a glacial lake found inside of a big bowl, and that bowl is called a cirque, and then you have moraine. So I mean, this image on my background that I took on a field trip has some of your answers right here on it, which is pretty cool. All right, so that being said, you've got 3 parts here, A, B, and C. We learned about these. I appreciate your time. Be sure to watch the lectures to go with this. It makes it so much easier when you have that background information within it. I shared them in the description below as well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe if you're not part of this and you're just joining us for a good time, and we'll talk soon.